Now I'm going to talk about the end of classical economics, and that involves the last classical economist. And one of the last classical economists was John Stuart Mill. He published his book on utilitarianism in 1863, his Principles of Political Economy in 1848, which remained the main text in classic political economy even into the 1930s. He wrote his book on liberty in 1859, his pamphlet on the Negro question in 1850, and on the subjugation of women in 1869. John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill, decided he should be a genius, and so started his education at the age of 2. At 5, he was discussing political economy with his dad's friend, David Ricardo. He grew up to be an economist, mathematician, political philosopher, and in many ways the greatest of the mainstream classical political economists. He made many contributions to classical economics, but there are 4 that are very important. First of all, he, like his father, tried to bring utilitarianism into classical political economy or classical economics. He argued that utility was a basis for making decisions and for valuing things, but he did not totally reject the labor theory of value. So his discussion of value and of labor and utility was very ambiguous. Very importantly, because it created a great deal of controversy, is he rejects the iron law of wages, which we talked about earlier. The iron law of wages says that wages will always have to be at subsistence because there is a wage fund that cannot be exceeded without cutting into the profits of business owners, thereby limiting investment and stopping them from causing the economy to grow, or more importantly and more likely in classical economics, keeping everybody employed because of Say's law. Why did he argue this? He noted that labor unions, which had begun to emerge, had been successful at raising workers' wages without lowering profits. Okay? And so while some workers' wages would be above subsistence and some would be competed down to subsistence in the case of ununionized and unskilled labor, the wage bill could go up without damaging profits and therefore investment. This was very controversial because it implied that Say's law did not hold and that the steady state may not be where the classical economy ended up. He also took up the women's question. He married a woman who was a women's right advocate. Through her influence, he argued that the role of women in the economy was inequitable and a problem unresolved in economics of labor markets and political participation. Indeed, he argued that there was the lost production that women might be able to contribute, thereby diminishing the total output of the economy. He also argued against slavery. Many of his contemporaries argued in favor of slavery, but he did not. John Stuart Mill's influence on classical political economy, on our political theory, on legislation, all of these things was enormous during his period of time. But he was not the very last classical political economist. That would be Karl Marx. Karl Marx's main book is Capital, Volume 1 in 1867. Marx's economics is a direct interpretation and extension of David Ricardo's economics. As you'll recall, David Ricardo's economics is quite deductive. His work is very mainstream. Marx was influenced by the German philosopher Georg Hegel, and Hegel's method was dialectics. Hegel was interested in the development and improvement of ideas because he believed social behavior was the result of ideas. As such, he's referred to as an idealist. Ideas cause material reality. His theory goes like this. Every idea implies its opposite. Idea A implies not A. Thus, A and not A are, by definition, contradictory. By exploring and trying to resolve this conflict or contradiction, we discover a new idea drawn from them both. Idea B. Basically, A is the thesis, not A is the antithesis, and B is the synthesis. And through application of this method, human ideas change and improve. Marx alternately was a materialist. He thought material reality as experienced by human beings caused both their ideas. The ideas were an effect of material reality, whereas for Hegel, ideas were the cause of material reality. And the resolution of the conflict of material interests in society, class conflict in his case, resulted in social change. As Marx put it, he found Hegel standing on his head and turned him right side up. The conflict of importance in all societies for Marx was class conflict. Marx named the market system and the resulting society of Western Europe capitalism. Capitalism was the latest in a series of economic systems, and the material conflict was between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, meaning capitalists and laborers. His contributions to economics were enormous, and they were the following. By the time Marx was analyzing capitalist economies, they were large enough to experience periods of crisis, what we call depressions. These fluctuations were not apparent to the earlier classical economists because the market system had been rather small and compared to agriculture. Marx noted full employment did not always occur, and it was clear capitalist economies were unstable by his time. This was not supposed to be possible under Say's law of markets in classical economics. Marx then demonstrated why this occurred and why it was getting worse with each recession depression. He showed why it would continue until capitalism collapsed. We will talk about that when we talk about Marx. Most importantly, Marx used the labor theory value of Ricardo to demonstrate that capitalist production exploited labor. Since labor created the value under the labor theory of value in classical economics, why did capitalists get the profits? The capitalists were expropriating, stealing, the value created by labor. This is a logical and indisputable conclusion resulting from the labor theory of value, but it eliminates the possibility of arguing that capitalism is inherently fair. Indeed, this logical argument points out that under these circumstances in the labor theory of value, capitalism is inherently unfair, an idea that would be very impalatable to the classical economist and, of course, to the bourgeoisie. Marx showed that capitalist production was alienating, that it diminished humankind in the process of producing it by separating workers from their product, by separating them from their life, and by separating them from their fellow workers through capitalist production processes. Additionally, Marx showed that capitalism resulted in pathological consumption patterns in the working class as a result of this alienation. In the framework of classical economics, there was no refuting Marx's conclusions. It helps to be correct. He recommended a change in the system about which he actually wrote very little, namely socialism and communism. And what he did write, most of it wouldn't really strike anyone today as particularly radical, except it included the elimination and abolition of private property. This created a major crisis in classical economics that could not be fixed. Economists might like to deny Marx's conclusions, but they really could not dispute them using classical economics. Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, a classical/Austrian economist, wrote a book called Karl Marx and the Close of His System, where he argued, quote, "The labor theory of value is the taproot of Marxism." This would be the focus of the marginalist revolution in mainstream economics. If you did not get rid of the labor theory of value, you had to accept Marx's analysis. But if you took that idea of utility and substituted it for labor, thereby moving the focus of economics from classical economics, where the focus is production, to marginalist economics, where the focus is consumption, you could avoid those conclusions. So the next group of economists we will be looking at is the marginalist in the marginalist revolution. Thanks.